we have to ask you at least one about Gary Cohn leaving. I mean, you've worked with him. He was really instrumental in getting the tax cuts through. Does his departure pose any dangers for the pro-growth agenda that the president set out?
Well, I can tell you that Gary Cohn was well respected up here on the Hill. He was one of the go-to guys. He's one of the individuals that we would go to get information, to pass messages back and forth. He will be missed up here. And look, he was a very positive force for economic development in the United States, and his departure is simply not good. And so I recognize that the president has the ability to go on out and to find some very good people to replace him, but he's going to be a tough one to replace.
So, Senator, let's turn to this banking legislation that you're co-sponsor of now. Tell us why there is the bipartisan support. Now, it's not everyone, of course. People like Elizabeth Warren, Shery Brown are against it, but you've got a lot of Democrats joining you, like Senator Heitkamp, Senator Warner, and things. Why is it that Democrats are going along with you?
Dodd-Frank, when it was originally instituted, was a 2,300-page bill. And in doing so, it has created thousands of pages of regulations that now have the impacts of which have been seen. It didn't just go after the Wall Street giants, it went after small banks as well. Today you have small banks that can't survive simply because of the regulatory costs involved. You're seeing a consolidation of small banks across the upper Midwest as well around the rest of the United States. So there's a lot of folks who live in rural areas or who do business with local, smaller community banks, regional banks, that are suddenly now realizing just how serious of an impact this had on the cost of doing business and the fact that that was being passed on to consumers. So we did a couple of things that were common sense in nature. I think I've got 7 different provisions in the bill right now, but we started talking about whether or not it was necessary to actually have banks identified as too big to fail, starting at as low as $50 billion in assets. We've moved that in this bill up to 250, but we've allowed the regulators to take a look at anything over $100 billion and to occasionally stress test. We think that's healthy. We also talked about making specific changes that Republicans and Democrats can both agree on that help banks to be able to extend credit to consumers. That's what this is all about.
Having said that, this, as you mentioned, is a more moderate bill than what the House passed last year. Do you expect big changes there?
Well, I like a lot of the things that Chairman Hensarling had suggested in the House provisions. But remember, in the Senate, it takes 60 votes to pass anything. We've got a bill right now that can pass the United States Senate. We can look at making some modifications, but I really would not expect major changes from what the bill looks like today.
One of the things that you had to compromise on was about the power of the CFPB, the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. How will the GOP address this issue in the future?
Well, number one, we've got a president that clearly understands that CFPB does not work correctly, and that a lot of it has to do with the person in charge. Until such time as we have the votes to severely restrict what the CFPB does, we've got a man in charge on a temporary basis who understands that. And I think the focus there is not going to be one on regulating people out of business or in penalizing businesses for trying to do business or to be innovative. And so for right now, we think we've got some breathing room. But in the meantime, I think there's going to be more emphasis placed on making modifications in CFPB in the future. But remember, this is one that Democrats have a real difficult time addressing, and they catch a lot of heat from the far left. So rather than losing an entire bill, we agreed to modify what we'd like to do at CFPB, because we do have folks in charge over there right now that understand, as we do, that they do more damage than they do good with their regulatory attitude that they've had over the last couple of years.
Senator, part of Dodd-Frank involved the so-called Volcker Rule. And former chairman of the Fed, Paul Volcker, has come out. And although he has said he thinks there's room for reform and he applauds reform, he thinks maybe you're going too far. I'll put a quote up here. I'm sure you've read it, saying, "I know from my long experience in banking and savings and loan regulation that plausibly small loopholes can be gamed and exploited with unfortunate consequences." How have you satisfied yourself that this doesn't go too far? We don't want to go back to the bad old days of 2007. I don't think any of us.
Well, you have to remember what caused 2007 in the first place. A lot of it had to do with a very high spike in energy prices. The price of gas went up to $5 a gallon in a lot of cases. And then you had people who had been able to do home mortgages at a very risky number in terms of we tried to get everybody into a house, and sometimes some of those folks had mortgages that had adjustable rate mortgages. It was a housing crisis that really brought this all about to begin with. Individual consumers simply couldn't pay their gas bill and pay an increase in the interest rate on some mortgages that they had a tough time qualifying for in the first place. that was the beginning of the process. And the derivatives that had been sold off of those housing loans to begin with was also added in because everybody was participating. So what we've tried to do in this particular case is not look at making major reforms for Wall Street, but rather what is focused in this bill is on community banks, regional banks, giving them the opportunity to, just as an example, smaller banks to actually be able to make more home mortgage loans under HMDA without making onerous reporting requirements a necessity. We've also talked about being able to take in and to actually buy municipal bonds right now and to be able to count those assets when we're talking about being a qualified asset. So those are the types of things we're doing. We're really not making major changes that impact Wall Street, but we are making some significant changes that will impact regional and community banks.